Somewhere in the United States right now, there is nuclear material that nobody can fully account for. Not because it was stolen in some dramatic heist, not because a rogue scientist smuggled it across a border in a briefcase, but because the systems designed to track it lost the thread. And this hasn't happened once. It's happened hundreds of times. That fact alone should stop you in your tracks. The United States spends more on national security than the next several countries combined. It has agencies, protocols, classified databases, and entire bureaucratic infrastructures dedicated to one purpose: keeping dangerous material out of the wrong hands. And yet, year after year, reports surface from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, and the Government Accountability Office documenting nuclear and radiological material that is lost, stolen, or simply unaccounted for. The question isn't whether this happens. The documented record proves that it does. The real question is how and why it keeps happening. To understand the problem, you first need to understand what we're actually talking about, because nuclear material is not one thing. At the top of the danger hierarchy is weapons-grade material, highly enriched uranium and plutonium, capable of sustaining the kind of chain reaction that levels a city. This is the stuff of nightmares, subject to the most stringent security in the world, physically protected at facilities where the perimeter security alone could survive a military assault. Losing track of even a gram of this material sets off alarms at the highest levels of government. Then, there's reactor fuel, lower enriched uranium used to generate power, still tightly regulated, but present in far more locations and moving through far more hands as it travels between fabrication facilities, power plants, and disposal sites. Below that sits a vast and sometimes overlooked category: radiological sources. These are materials like cesium-137, cobalt-60, americium-241, and iridium-192, used every day in medical equipment, industrial gauges, oil well sensors, and cancer treatment machines. They are not weapons grade. Most of them could not fuel a nuclear bomb. But in the wrong configuration, in the wrong hands, they could be fashioned into what's commonly called a dirty bomb, a conventional explosive laced with radioactive material designed not to level buildings, but to contaminate a city center, trigger mass panic, and render entire blocks economically unusable for years. When officials describe material as unaccounted for, they're using language that is deliberately careful and sometimes frustratingly vague. They don't always mean the material has vanished from the physical world. They mean the paperwork trail has broken down, or an inventory came up short, or a source was transferred and the receiving end never logged it properly, or a device containing radioactive material was abandoned, scrapped, or lost during a company closure. In the regulatory universe, so unaccounted for is a technical term that can describe anything from an administrative error to a genuine disappearance. And the system doesn't always distinguish clearly between the two until an investigation is already underway. That ambiguity is part of what makes this so alarming. A discrepancy in the books might be nothing more than a clerical mistake corrected within days, or it might be the first sign that something has gone genuinely wrong. You don't always know which one you're dealing with immediately, and in the interim, the window for intervention is open. The quantities involved matter enormously, and this is where public intuition often fails. People hear a small amount of radioactive material and assume small risk. But the isotope, the enrichment level, and the intended application change everything. A pellet of polonium-210, small enough to dissolve invisibly in a cup of tea, was used to assassinate Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006, contaminating dozens of locations across the city and costing British authorities an extraordinary investigation. Certain medical radiological sources, if concentrated and weaponized, carry enough activity to cause radiation sickness at close range, or to make a public space dangerously uninhabitable. And even quantities of fissile material well below what's typically called a significant quantity by international standards are taken with deadly seriousness by proliferation experts who understand that multiple small losses could, in theory, be aggregated. A few cases made it impossible to dismiss these concerns as theoretical. In 2017, a truck carrying radioactive iridium-192, a source used in industrial radiography, was stolen in Mexico. The material had originated in the United States and was in transit when it disappeared. It was eventually recovered, but the incident illustrated exactly how a chain of legitimate handoffs can create gaps in oversight. Earlier, in 2012, the GAO published a report finding that over a 6-year period, more than 1,500 incidents involving lost or stolen radioactive sources had been reported to the NRC in the United States alone. Not all of those involved material that stayed missing, but many did. Industrial gauges containing cesium and americium turned up in scrap metal yards, having been stripped out of equipment without anyone alerting regulators. When medical devices were disposed of improperly, sources were simply abandoned when the companies that owned them went out of business, left sitting in warehouses or storage units with no active custodian. And then there are the cases closer to the core of the weapons complex. Inspector General reports from the Department of Energy have, over the years, flagged inventory discrepancies at facilities handling more sensitive materials, discrepancies that were later resolved on paper, but that raised pointed questions about the reliability of tracking systems in the first place. Which brings us back to the central tension here. This is a country that has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building a security architecture around its nuclear complex. It has classified programs, hardened facilities, armed response teams, and international agreements specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of loss. And still, the gaps appear. Still, the audits find discrepancies. Still, the trucks get stolen and the sources go missing. The answer isn't simple negligence, and it isn't a single broken system. It's something more complicated, a collision between the enormous scale of the nuclear enterprise, the fragmented nature of who regulates what, the long tail of legacy materials from the Cold War era, and the persistent difficulty of tracking objects that are sometimes intentionally designed to be invisible to casual detection. Understanding how material slips out of view requires looking at each of those fault lines in turn. The nuclear enterprise in the United States is not one system. It is dozens of overlapping systems: military, civilian, medical, industrial, and research, each with its own regulatory framework, its own record-keeping conventions, and its own definition of what counts as adequate accountability. The Department of Energy manages the weapons complex. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversees civilian reactors, medical facilities, and industrial users. The Department of Defense runs its own nuclear enterprise under separate authority. The Department of Transportation regulates how material moves between locations. And beneath all of them sits a constellation of contractors, subcontractors, universities, hospitals, and private companies, each holding licenses for material they use in day-to-day operations. When you map it out, what you find is not a unified tracking infrastructure, but a patchwork, one where a source can move from one jurisdiction to another and briefly inhabit a gap where nobody has clear responsibility for it. This complexity alone would be difficult enough, but there's a deeper problem built into the physics of what's being tracked. Measuring nuclear material is not like counting boxes in a warehouse. When you process uranium or plutonium, some of it becomes waste. Some of it coats the walls of processing vessels. Some of it gets absorbed into contaminated equipment, or migrates into scrap, or distributes itself through a facility in ways that are genuinely difficult to measure with precision. The technical term for this is material unaccounted for, or MUF. And it is not a sign of failure. It is an expected artifact of the measurement process. The problem is that MUF has a tolerance threshold, and when losses consistently approach or occasionally exceed that threshold, distinguishing between a measurement artifact and an actual loss becomes an investigative challenge rather than a routine calculation. You can have a facility running entirely within its regulatory limits and still have genuine uncertainty about where a small fraction of its inventory actually is. Legacy record keeping makes this worse. The United States has been handling nuclear material in large quantities since the Manhattan Project. Facilities that have been processing, storing, or disposing of material for 70+ years carry with them decades of paperwork. Paper records, early digital databases, handwritten logs, new records that were never digitized, records that were digitized incorrectly, and records that were simply lost when facilities changed hands, when contractors were replaced, or when buildings were demolished during site cleanup. The DOE's own Inspector General has repeatedly found cases where historical discrepancies traced back not to recent mismanagement, but to accounting practices from the 1950s and 1960s that nobody ever went back to reconcile. At several Cold War-era production sites, the total amount of material that passed through the facility over decades was measured in ways that are now known to be imprecise, leaving permanent uncertainty in the inventory baseline. Contractor sprawl amplifies every one of these vulnerabilities. The weapons complex has never been run exclusively by the federal government. From the earliest days, the design, production, and maintenance of nuclear weapons was delegated to private contractors, companies like Bechtel, Lockheed Martin, and various specialized defense firms operating under DOE oversight. This model created efficiency in some areas and persistent accountability gaps in others. When a contractor manages a facility for years and then is replaced by a different contractor, the handoff of records, responsibilities, and institutional knowledge is rarely seamless. Material that was meticulously tracked under one contractor's system may not map cleanly onto another's. Chain of custody documentation gets fragmented. Personnel with deep knowledge of where legacy material is stored retire or move on, and because each contractor has its own internal processes, the oversight agencies are sometimes comparing apples to oranges when they try to reconcile inventories across a complex that spans dozens of sites and hundreds of thousands of acres. Then, there is the problem that secrecy was always meant to solve, but sometimes made worse. Classification is essential. Nobody argues that detailed information about weapons-grade stockpiles should be publicly accessible. But classification also creates environments where problems can be buried. When an internal inventory discrepancy is classified, the circle of people authorized to know about it, investigate it, and report on it becomes very small. External auditors may not have the clearances to examine the relevant records. Congressional oversight is limited to members with appropriate access. Inspectors general sometimes find that classified programs were not disclosed to them until well after the fact. The secrecy that protects the material from adversaries can simultaneously insulate the management of that material from the accountability mechanisms designed to catch mistakes before they grow into genuine losses. Old facilities compound every one of these dynamics. Many of the sites that remain active in the nuclear complex were built in the 1940s and 1950s, designed for the production demands of the Cold War, and never fully modernized. Their infrastructure, including the physical containment systems, the measurement equipment, and the data management systems, reflects the technology of their era. Upgrading these facilities is extraordinarily expensive, takes years, and requires maintaining operations while construction happens around live nuclear material. In the interim, facilities continue operating on systems that were never designed to meet modern inventory standards. The DOE has acknowledged that certain legacy sites carry inherent measurement uncertainty that cannot be fully resolved without decommissioning and full characterization, a process that, for some facilities, remains decades away. What this adds up to is a tracking problem that isn't really a tracking problem. It's a structural condition. The scale of the enterprise, the physics of the material, the fragmented regulatory landscape, the depth of the Cold War legacy, and the protective layers of classification have combined to create an environment where perfect accountability was probably never achievable, and where the systems designed to approximate it have consistently struggled to keep pace with the complexity underneath them. The cases that eventually surfaced in public reporting didn't expose a sudden breakdown. They exposed fault lines that had been accumulating for generations. Those fault lines didn't stay hidden forever. Over the decades, specific incidents broke through, some through whistleblowers, some through government audits, some through investigative journalism, and each one pulled back the curtain on a different layer of the problem. Taken together, they sketch a picture that is more complicated than the headlines suggested and more troubling than official responses usually admitted. One of the most significant early exposures came from the Rocky Flats plant outside Denver, Colorado. Rocky Flats was the primary facility for manufacturing plutonium triggers, the cores at the heart of thermonuclear weapons, from the late 1940s through 1989. When the FBI and EPA conducted a surprise raid on the facility in 1989, what they found wasn't a dramatic heist scenario. What they found was systemic contamination, improper waste disposal, and inventory records so tangled that nobody could say with confidence how much plutonium had migrated into the soil, the drainage systems, and the surrounding environment over 4 decades of operations. The plant was shut down and never reopened. A subsequent cleanup cost nearly $7 billion and took over a decade. What Rocky Flats revealed wasn't theft. It revealed that a facility handling weapons-grade material at industrial scale had been operating for generations without the accounting infrastructure that the public had every reason to assume existed. The material wasn't stolen. Much of it was simply lost into the environment, and the records couldn't tell you how much. The contrast between alarming headlines and investigative conclusions appears repeatedly across these cases. In 2007, the Air Force inadvertently flew 6 nuclear warheads from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana on a B-52 that its crew believed was carrying only conventional cruise missiles. For roughly 36 hours, the weapons were unaccounted for within the chain of command. The initial news cycle treated this as a potential security catastrophe. What investigators later confirmed was different in character, but no less serious in implication. The weapons were never at risk of detonation or theft, but the incident exposed a profound failure in handling procedures, attention culture, and the institutional discipline surrounding nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War Air Force. Personnel had become so habituated to routine that the exceptional became invisible. The material was never missing in the sense of being unlocated. It was physically present the entire time. But it was unaccounted for within the systems designed to ensure that someone, at every moment, knows exactly where every weapon is. That gap was the problem. Civilian institutions produced their own set of revealing cases. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has documented hundreds of incidents involving lost or abandoned radiological sources, not weapons-grade material, but radioactive sources used in medical imaging, industrial gauges, and construction equipment. A recurring pattern involves companies that go out of business, equipment that gets sold or scrapped, and sources that end up in scrap metal facilities or landfills with no clear chain of custody. In one class of incidents, radioactive gauges used in oil and gas exploration were simply left in storage facilities, abandoned on work sites, or sold as scrap without proper disposal. Some were later recovered. Others entered secondary markets and were only detected when radiation alarms at scrapyards triggered alerts. These cases don't involve classified material or national security secrets, but they illustrate a consistent accounting weakness at the downstream end of the civilian nuclear chain, the point where material is no longer actively useful and the incentive to track it carefully has largely disappeared. Weapons laboratory incidents cut closer to the national security core. Los Alamos National Laboratory, the birthplace of the atomic bomb and still one of the primary design facilities for the U.S. nuclear arsenal, has faced repeated scrutiny over classified media and nuclear material accounting. In 2004, an audit found that the laboratory could not account for hundreds of computer hard drives containing classified nuclear weapons information, a different category than physical material, but illustrating the same underlying weakness in custody culture. More directly relevant were recurring findings by the DOE Inspector General that measurement discrepancies at Los Alamos had gone unresolved for years, with some traced to processing losses from decades earlier that had never been fully characterized. Investigators repeatedly found not evidence of theft or diversion, but evidence that the record-keeping had simply not been robust enough to distinguish one from the other with certainty, which, from a security standpoint, is its own category of failure. Some cases remain genuinely unresolved, which is what makes them most troubling for long-term public trust. The historical inventory at several Cold War production facilities, Hanford and Washington State chief among them, involves quantities of material processed over such long time frames, using measurement techniques now understood to be imprecise, that the uncertainty in the baseline cannot be fully closed. Hanford processed roughly 67,000 metric tons of uranium fuel over its operational life, and the waste management challenges there are well documented. But the accounting uncertainty runs deeper than waste. It involves plutonium production estimates that carry error margins large enough to represent significant quantities of material. Officials have consistently maintained that there is no evidence of diversion or theft, and that is accurate. The problem is that the evidence base is incomplete enough that certainty in either direction, loss or no loss, is genuinely difficult to establish. That ambiguity doesn't resolve cleanly, and it doesn't disappear with time. What connects all of these cases is something more important than the individual facts. Each one eroded a layer of assumed competence. The public generally operates on the premise that an enterprise as consequential as nuclear material management must be, by definition, tightly controlled, that somewhere in the federal government, someone has a precise count of every significant quantity of fissile material, and that any deviation from that count would trigger immediate, effective response. The cases that have surfaced over the years suggest that assumption was never fully warranted, not because the people involved were negligent or indifferent, but because the scale, age, complexity, and internal contradictions of the system were never fully compatible with the level of precision the public assumed was there. Each incident, Rocky Flats, Minot, the abandoned industrial sources, the laboratory discrepancies, the Hanford accounting gaps, confirmed that the gap between assumed accountability and actual accountability was real, persistent, and in some cases, irreducible. And that gap doesn't just matter as history, it matters for everything being built and managed today. That gap between assumed accountability and actual accountability isn't a relic. It's a living condition, and the reason it matters today is more grounded and more urgent than most people realize. Not because a nuclear weapon is about to go missing in some cinematic sense, but because the slow accumulation of unresolved vulnerabilities carries its own category of serious risk. Start with the most immediate threat. A dirty bomb, a conventional explosive device packed with radioactive material, does not require weapons-grade plutonium or highly enriched uranium. It requires something far more accessible, a radiological source of the kind that exists in hospital basements, construction sites, industrial storage facilities, and improperly decommissioned equipment scattered across dozens of countries. The United States has done meaningful work to recover and secure orphaned sources domestically, and international programs like the Global Threat Reduction Initiative have made genuine progress in repatriating vulnerable material from sites around the world. But the pipeline of potentially available material is long, the tracking systems in poorer countries are weaker, and illicit trafficking cases, documented by the International Atomic Energy Agency, continue to surface with regularity. The IAEA's Incident and Trafficking Database has recorded thousands of confirmed cases of unauthorized possession or movement of nuclear and radiological material since the mid-1990s. Most involve small quantities. Some do not. The trend line has not moved decisively in the right direction. Insider threats represent a dimension that gets discussed carefully in security circles and almost never in public policy debates. The most effective path to diverting nuclear material has never been a sophisticated external operation. It has always been someone already inside the system, with authorized access, who decides that access can be exploited. The U.S. has invested heavily in personnel reliability programs, behavioral monitoring, and access controls. Those programs are real and they matter. Nandi, but institutional complacency, the same force that allowed the Minot incident to happen, the same culture that let Rocky Flats operate for decades without adequate oversight, is the persistent enemy of any security program that becomes routine. When the threat feels abstract and distant, vigilance erodes. When procedures become habit rather than intention, gaps open. This is not a criticism of individuals. It is a structural observation about how human organizations behave over time, and nuclear security institutions are not exempt from it. The United States has, without question, improved dramatically since the worst years of Cold War-era accounting practices. The Department of Energy has modernized its material control and accounting systems. Standardized measurement protocols are more rigorous. Independent auditing has expanded, whilst the NRC has strengthened reporting requirements for civilian sources. These are not cosmetic improvements. They represent decades of hard-won institutional learning, some of it driven directly by the incidents that exposed the system's weaknesses. A fair accounting of the current situation acknowledges that the baseline today is genuinely better than it was in 1970 or 1985 or even 2000. But serious blind spots remain, and honesty about them matters. The legacy facilities, Hanford above all, carry accounting uncertainties that no amount of modernization can fully close retroactively. The historical measurement gaps are permanent features of the record. Some portion of the question, how much material was produced and what happened to all of it, will never have a precise answer. At the same time, the civilian sector continues to generate new accountability challenges as technology changes faster than regulatory frameworks can adapt. Emerging applications of radioactive materials in medicine, energy research, and industrial processes are creating new categories of sources that require tracking infrastructure not yet fully in place. The problem isn't static, it evolves. There is a genuine tension at the center of how the government communicates about all of this, and it deserves to be named directly. Official statements about nuclear security consistently emphasize competence, improvement, and the absence of confirmed losses to adversaries or terrorists. Those statements are generally accurate as far as they go. But they stop short of acknowledging the full weight of what absence of confirmed evidence actually means in a system with documented measurement uncertainty and incomplete historical records. Reassuring the public is a legitimate institutional interest. So is democratic accountability. When those two interests diverge, when transparency about genuine vulnerabilities is subordinated to the management of public anxiety, the result is an informed citizenry that cannot meaningfully evaluate the security posture of one of the most consequential programs the government runs. That is a democratic problem, not just a technical one. Perfect control over nuclear material is not achievable. The physics of measurement, the scale of legacy contamination, the complexity of global supply chains, and the irreducible element of human behavior inside large institutions all guarantee some level of irreducible uncertainty. Acknowledging that is not defeatism. It is the necessary starting point for making realistic decisions about where stronger accountability and targeted modernization can produce meaningful improvement, and where they cannot. The goal is not a perfect ledger. The goal is a system transparent enough to catch failures early, honest enough to report them accurately, and accountable enough to correct them rather than quietly absorb them into the background noise of institutional routine. That is the core of what this history actually teaches. The danger is not the cinematic scenario, the mastermind, the stolen warhead, the ticking clock. The danger is chronic systems failure, measurement gaps that widen quietly, oversight cultures that relax incrementally, accountability structures that lag behind the material realities they're supposed to track. That is a less dramatic story. It is also a more accurate one, and it is precisely the kind of story that requires sustained public attention to address. Which means the most important thing you can do with this information isn't to feel alarmed, it's to pay attention. Watch how your elected officials engage with nuclear oversight and transparency. Notice when audits are published and when they're buried. Ask whether the agencies responsible for tracking this material are adequately funded, independently audited, and genuinely accountable to the public that depends on them. Nuclear security policy is not a technical backwater. It is a direct expression of how seriously a society takes its most consequential obligations, and it deserves exactly that level of scrutiny.